Okay, everybody, shall we convene? Someone's coming in. I'll just let the last people come in. No, it's fine, it's fine. It's Friday morning. While we're just sorting ourselves out, two people have pointed out to me that on the programme for today, it says that the closing plenary at 11:30 will be in Lecture Theatre 2. Obviously, the programme just kind of abruptly terminated itself because actually it will be in here, same as everyone else. So I've even forgotten what number this is. 26, 36. Thank you, Harry. Okay, well, I'm very pleased to welcome you and to congratulate you for having stayed the course to the final section of the Summer Institute. I can't say I'm delighted to introduce the next speaker, but I'm very pleased to be doing it. Somebody said, should I have someone introduce me, but I figured you all know who I am by now. So. Although I did think, when I scheduled myself last on this programme, I don't think I thought this through because I'm coming after, all this fabulous week of stuff. So, as I said to, I think it was Alison, that perhaps I should advise you to prepare for a massive anticlimax. We'll see. Okay, well, I'm just going to launch into it now. My title is The First Secret of the Stammerer, Researching Without Representation. And this is the quotation from Deleuze's Logic of Sense, from which that phrase comes. Events are like crystals, they become and grow only out of the edges or on the edge. This is indeed the first secret of the stammerer, or of the left-handed person. No longer to sink, but to slide the whole length in such a way that the old depth no longer exists at all, having been reduced to the opposite side of the surface. I'm not going to pause right here to elaborate on this title, although I recognise that it's hardly self-explanatory. But I hope it will gradually release some kind of sense, perhaps growing out from its own edges, so to speak, as we go along. But it might be helpful to take one thing from the quote and hold on to it. And in fact, it is something that has recurred throughout the week, and that is it's about flatness, surface, length and lateral movement are all in this quote, and we've had flatness and surfaces this week. And like so many of our speakers this week, I'm currently exercised by the new materialisms or the new empiricisms and the implications for qualitative research. And I'm particularly interested in issues of language and representation, hence my title. So my overall aim today is to think about the place of language in a materialist methodology and what it might mean to engage the materiality of language itself in qualitative research. This might seem a bit paradoxical because, as we've heard from many speakers this week, excuse me, one of the main targets of the new materialisms has been language itself and its centrality in post-structuralist and discourse-based theory. So language has been, if you like, demoted in a lot of the new materialisms. It's much less central, it's much less significant, and much less powerful. And perhaps because of this, it's seen as much less of a problem for theory, which now has better things to preoccupy itself with. So this might seem the wrong time to be banging on about language. And the reason I'm doing it is probably partly to do with my own academic history. I was trained up in the dogma and the sterile, formal purity, if you like, of Chomskyan theoretical linguistics. And I seem to have spent the ensuing 30 years in a kind of halting flight from that initial mark upon me, staggering or maybe stammering from one dissenting theoretical tendency to another. So I have progressed through or regressed through ethnomethodology, discourse analysis, Derrida to wherever I am now. And all of these very different disciplines have at their core a persistent interrogation of the notion of language as a self-contained, rule-governed system for representing or reflecting the world. And I mean, as Hilary pointed out this week, it's particularly interesting for me that Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus set off from a critique of Chomsky in linguistics in their first plateau, where they developed the notion of the rhizome. But I hope there are other less solipsistic reasons for revisiting language. There's still work to be done, I think, in thinking about how language would figure, what it might do and what it shouldn't do in materially informed qualitative research. So today I'm going to revisit some of the examples and issues that I've been circling around for the past couple of years. Together with some new examples, I'll be revisiting some old ones. So my apologies to those of you who've seen these examples before. So much of my recent work's been written under the influence of Deleuze's logic of sense, and we've had various introductions to the logic of sense this week, particularly in Lisa's presentation yesterday. One of the many things that appeals to me about this maddeningly difficult book of Deleuze is that this is where he comes closest to a philosophy of language in relation to the materiality of bodies and the incorporeality of ideas or meanings. So working from my dim beginner's grasp of the logic of sense, I've found tantalizing glimpses of what it might mean to engage the materiality of language, its material force and its entanglements in bodies and matter. And logic of sense tells us that this would involve attending to a mad element that exists in language, something wild and unfamiliar that exceeds propositional meaning and resists the law of representation. And Deleuze called it sense, this wild element in language, and Lisa talked about it yesterday too. Sense is important for a materialist methodology because it works as what Deleuze calls a kind of Mobius strip between language and the world. And my slides have progressed from the not very interesting to the banal, but this is a Mobius strip. Okay. For like the 1.5 people who maybe don't know what that is. The Mobius strip is in fact another flat figure, this twisted strip that paradoxically only has one side or edge. So the ants in M.C. Escher's Mobius strip here, they can walk around the Mobius strip on both sides, as it were, but without actually crossing an edge. Sense is something that slides the whole length, the opening quote said, of the Mobius strip, or the metaphysical surface, hovering like a faint incorporeal mist, in Deleuze's words, between the depths of bodies and the airy heights of ideas. So it's precisely to sense that we might look to engage with the materiality, but also the virtuality of language. Sense, Deleuze says, happens to bodies and it insists in propositions, but it's not actually in either of them. It allows these to resonate together, bodies and propositions, with one another, while never being reducible to one side of this old language and reality duality. I don't need to spend too much time today outlining key features of the new materialisms, since our keynote speakers this week have already done a fantastic job of that. And in fact, I'm the beneficiary of something resonant and cumulative that's emerged across the presentations and the workshops this week, without at all being reducible to a set of precepts or a summary. And you could call that sense, too. Something has emerged this week. It does mean, however, that I hardly know where those other papers and the discussions they prompted and the musical improvisations and the artworks, I don't know where they end and I begin now, which is a bit of a dilemma. But of course, we're all in the middle, or strung out along the border, where, as Lisa told us yesterday, quoting Deleuze, everything happens. So, suffice it to say that the new materialisms, as we've heard this week, insist on the significance of materiality in social and cultural practices. So as we've heard, these theories have had enough of the idea that nature is just a kind of scenery or container or a backdrop for the playing out of the humanist adventures of culture. And Takaraho and Allison powerfully reminded us this week there are nations and cultures that have never held to that old Cartesian dualism in the first place. Materialist scholars are also tired of the aggressive anthropocentrism, and we've heard of that this week, of theories that privilege human consciousness and agency. And many of them have had enough too of that long war of attrition that qualitative research has fought with science as the bad other or the big brother of the humanities and the social sciences. And in many ways, speaking for myself at least, this is a relief. We can now dispense with all that posturing and piety and pointless Nietzschean resentment, but obviously not with alliteration, sorry about that, about how science-based research gets its money, gets all the money and all the prestige. And in fact, it's very exciting, as Betty said at the start of the week. We're still discovering what new practices and forms of thought might be emerging in these new entanglements of science and the social. Karen Barad has tangled with quantum physics. Deleuze's philosophy is animated by complexity theory and strange mathematics. But of course, there are also some crucial implications for the very notion of qualitative research, and I think we were approaching that towards the end of the week, which has often defined itself against some notion of science. So we're only beginning to come to terms with what qualitative research could mean, or indeed what will be left of it, with the dissolution of that and those other boundaries. So, moving somewhat closer to my topic, I've already mentioned that new materialist theories have also had enough of the privileging of language and discourse in the post-structuralist and linguistic terms in theory that have been so influential over the past 20, 30 years or more. And writers such as Karen Barad and Susan Heckman have criticised, and Hillevi mentioned this, what they call the pervasive representationalism of discourse-oriented theory, which renders material realities inaccessible behind the linguistic or discourse systems that supposedly construct or mediate or represent them. And I agree with Betty that some of this critique has been a little overheated and in fact not all that helpful. Still, it's true that much post-structural theory has been preoccupied with language and representation, if only through a kind of sustained battle against the notion of language as representation. But that battle itself has paradoxically kept language to the forefront. And here I am doing it again today. Anyway, we've now arrived sort of at the second part of my title, which refers to representation. For the moment, I'm referring back to the opening quote, but particularly referring back to Hillevi's wonderful presentation yesterday. For the moment, when you think of representation, think about depth and hierarchy and structure and up and down relations rather than lateral ones. Okay? Representation, which is by no means restricted to language, is the logic of categorization and subordination. Manuel de Landa calls it typological. Representation locks things down, categorizes them, bifurcates the world into signifiers and signifieds, subjects and predicates, words and worlds, all of that, governments and people, genus and species. And the critique of representation is a key element of Deleuze's philosophy. For him, representational thought is what he calls sedentary. It's the enemy of difference, movement, change, and the emergence of the new. Pure difference, difference in itself, in Deleuze's words, is crucified by representation. It's trussed up and it's pinned in place by what Deleuze called its quadripartite fetters, under which only that which is identical, similar, analogous, or opposed can be considered difference. So representation only captures differences among already formed entities. And for Deleuze, representation serves what he called the dogmatic image of thought. It categorizes and judges the world through the administration of good sense and common sense, dispensed by the supposedly autonomous, rationalist, and well-intentioned individual according to principles of truth and error. I had too much wine last night, so I'm thirsty. And a little tired. So, as Hillevi, in her beautiful slides, I have, by the way, and in parentheses, I have steadily increasing PowerPoint shame and envy because everyone does these things so much better than I do. But anyway, representation is arborescent and tree-like, as Hillevi beautifully outlined yesterday with her fantastic visual images. And it so happens that one of the classic instances of a tree diagram is the grammatical tree for generating the structure of the sentence in Chomskyan linguistics. So the root sentence bifurcates into noun phrase and verb phrase, NP and VP, which then further subdivide into adjective and an embedded noun phrase and then a verb phrase, which then follows its way through. And in fact, the sentence at the foot of this tree is a famous example from Chomsky himself. It's intended to show how this kind of grammar, which is called a phrase structure grammar, can generate sentences that are grammatically well formed, even if they're semantically meaningless. And now this claim of meaningless in this very sentence has actually been debated quite a lot, and I might come back to it, but I just want to suggest here for the moment that While that sentence may indeed not have conventional propositional meaning, it does arguably have sense in Deleuzian terms. Something rises off this like a faint mist. So the linguistic tree diagram, I'll stop saying as Hilary said yesterday now and just accept that I am forging her signature, or it's a refrain and it's coming again. The linguistic tree diagram was at the heart of Deleuze and Guattari's critique of representation, and it was against that logic that they developed the notion of the rhizome with its transversal, decentered organization. And the earliest elaboration of the rhizome, as I said, is that of language, and this is a famous quote. A rhizome ceaselessly establishes connections between semiotic chains, organizations of power, and circumstances relative to the arts, science, and social struggles. There's no language in itself, nor are there any linguistic universals, only a throng of dialect, patois, slang, and specialized languages. And they went on to argue that language doesn't spring from a root, as we said, whether historically or structurally, but rather you could think of it as spreading like a patch of oil, which I think is a wonderful phrase, and this is a longer quote. Language stabilizes around a parish, a bishopric, a capital. It evolves by subterranean streams and flows along river valleys or train tracks. It spreads like a patch of oil. So, I mean, one way of thinking again of that lateral thing is think of the patch of oil. Let's go back to the arborescent logic of representation, which is a very old logic. Hilary made this quote yesterday, and I've got it in my paper too. Deleuze and Guattari called it the oldest and weariest kind of thought. Now, the materialist critique of representation, and this is important, I think, for some of the discussions we've had here and in the sessions, doesn't deny that it does indeed happen, and that its cultural, ideological, and symbolic productions are a legitimate focus for research. The logic of representation is, after all, in Jean-Jacques Le Cercle's words, the structuring process that constructs a livable world around us, producing stable meaning and stable subjects to exchange it. But representation is seen as a second-order invention in materialist theory, Deleuzian theory, what Brian Masumi calls a stop operation or a back formation that creates structure and stasis out of movement and drags vertical structure from the dispersal of things. And there are scholars, as we talked yesterday, who are trying to address issues of how those vertical structures of politics or power or capital emerge from a flat materialist ontology. So people like Brian Masumi, John Protevi, and I forgot to mention yesterday, Patricia Clough, who's done some very interesting work on how Deleuzian notions of affect and intensity have made themselves available for new forms of capital, which is operating now a logic of preemption and kind of seizing and manipulating our affects in advance. Anyway, so I know that is a concern, and it is perhaps a topic for another conference about how we tackle power and structure in these new forms. But for the moment, as we know, materialist thought prefers a flattened logic, as we've heard many times this week, where discourse and matter are mutually implicated in the unfolding emergence of the world. So we're back with flatness again, although it has different terms and different theories. There's the assemblage in Deleuze and Guattari. Barad often talks about entanglement. Pickering talks about the mangle in which of practice in which the discursive and the material consort. Delanda calls it a manifold. There's the actor network, as we've heard, and Le Cercle calls it a logic of unholy mixtures. In these flat assemblages, the world's not held still and forever separate from the linguistic or category systems that represented it, and language is only one element in the manifold of forces and intensities that are moving and connecting and diverging. So in the assemblage, in the flat structure, words collide and connect with things on the same ontological level, and therefore language can't achieve the distance and the externality that would allow it to represent, that is to stand over and stand for and stand in for the world. So in place of that representational logic, which Deleuze and Guattari call the logic of instead, the material discursive flat logic is a logic of and. And as we've heard many times this week, the subject is radically decentered in the collective assemblage of enunciation. Utterances don't come from inside an already constituted speaking subject. Language is already collective, social, and impersonal, and it pre-exists us, and my voice comes from elsewhere. Oop. I've missed that one. Deleuze writes about this: the collective assemblage is always like the murmur from which I take my proper name, the constellation of voices, concordant or not, from which I draw my voice. And again, I'm reminded of Te Kawaho talking about the Maori concept of whakapapa, and that we're always already within relationality. So our voices do not come from inside us, they're already out there. So you can see, and you've already heard from others, that the materialist critique of representation has radical implications for qualitative methodology, and that Betty, at the beginning of the week, outlined those problems very clearly and elegantly. It would no longer allow us to work under the auspices of common sense, wielded responsibly by autonomous human subjects, in other words, by well-trained, well-meaning qualitative researchers. We'd be no longer able to appeal to a fundamentally good sense, guiding wise judgment in the arbitration of categories, hierarchies, and the detection of error. Such wise judgments are based on the representational fetters of identity, similarity, analogy, and opposition, even though this might not be obvious, excuse me, at first sight. And they underpin the analytic exercise as conceived in many methods textbooks, as well as our everyday habits as researchers. For instance, as I've argued in Jessica and Becky's book, excuse me, Deleuze and Research Methodologies, conventional research coding is preeminently representational and arborescent. Here's an example from a website dedicated to grounded theory coding as developed by Glaser and Strauss. I mean, I'm not going to discuss the content of it, but as you can see, it's definitely a tree. It has the same arborescent structure as a Chomsky tree. However, it's not only when we do conventional coding that we're enacting the logic of representation. It regulates everything we do, including, of course, the talk that I'm giving now. Consider how many times we think and act according to the logic of instead in this way in relation to our data, whether this might be interview transcripts or field observations or documents or whatever. So whenever we do stuff like deciding this is like that, so we'll call it a theme, this piece of data is not like that one, that's an example of this belongs under that code, this is a metaphor for that. Metaphor is a kind of dualistic notion that's been strongly criticized by Deleuze and Guattari. This is a subcategory. This interviewee is not saying what she really thinks. Again, that's the idea that there's, what you think and what you say, and they're separate. This really means that. I could go on because it's utterly pervasive, and that is partly why it is such a challenge to try to step outside that. And as we've heard again this week, the materialist critique of representation would confound the very act of interpretation to the extent that this implies a critical, intentional subject standing separate and outside of the data, digging behind it or beyond it or beneath it to identify higher order meanings, themes, and categories. This again is the logic of representational thought. Instead of multiple instances, conventional interpretation substitutes patterns or meanings. Quoting Betty at the start of the week, what we need to do is to find ways of starting in the middle where things pick up speed. But that's easy to say, and for me, not so easy to do. Even explanation itself is generally representational, if by explanation what you're saying is, this really means that. And I've written before on the demand for explanation and the kind of analytical rage that can take over when we come across a piece of data, and I am going to continue for the moment to call it that, Betty. Where have I got to? Oh yeah. When you come across a piece of data that resists explanation and refuses to render up meaning and confounds good sense or common sense, you can get this kind of, teeth-gritted determination to find the thing that is eluding you. And that kind of explanation, is good sense or common sense, is always associated by Deleuze with the banal violence of ordinary representational language. So, for example, I've written before in connection with a research project that Liz Jones and Rachel Holmes and Christina McRae and I were involved in, about Hannah, who, when she was 5, wouldn't or couldn't utter her name during that morning school ritual of taking the register. And Hannah's silence sparked a kind of rage for explanation and meaning, as everyone sought to know why Hannah was mute, what might have caused her silence, what it meant, whether or not it was intentional. In other words, what the silence represented. And Lisa, in her previous work and yesterday, has given us an insight into how one might think about silence without thinking about it as representational. But the disconcerting force of Hannah's silence was eventful, precisely as a kind of blockage to the smooth operation of representation. It moved outwards in concentric circles to affect everyone in her ambit: class teachers, classmates, school staff, parents, of course us as researchers. And the undecidable nature of her silence, hanging in that strange threshold between language and something else, brought interpretation to a standstill in this torrent of unanswered questions. And this happened periodically throughout the project where we encountered Hannah, a point at which interpretation seemed to falter or stutter. That's a little reference to my title. Turning the rage for meaning back on itself in a kind of vibrating immobility. It's notable, at least in retrospect, how many of these instances occurred at the boundaries of language and the body, and that is relevant. Another example that we've written about more than once concerned a child who had started to vomit each day as lunchtime approached, and here we are back with vomit, and it's not purely coincidental, as we'll see. So, again, everyone, the school staff, we as researchers, attempted to bring the vomiting and the child into the scheme of representation, assuming that she or it must mean something, that we should be able to subsume the intransigent singularity of this miniature horror, this disconcerting and repeated eruption, beneath some higher order explanation. You could say that everyone wanted the vomiting to be codable, a sign of something else: attention-seeking, immaturity, lax parenting, timidity. But like Hannah's silence, the vomiting remained a point of indetermination between the materiality of the body excuse me, and the abstraction of meaning, quivering with the emotional and visceral intensities of sense, and refusing to offer itself up as either a signification or a mere bodily process, and in the process denying us, as so-called analysts, the comfort of retreat to the categorical heights where everything can be put in its proper place. So moments such as these, when bodily matters simultaneously demand and defy translation into codes and significations, expose the workings of representation in education and research. Children's actions and their affects are fixed and tagged as instances of something else, such as behaviour. This was the focus of our project. But these moments also productively frustrate the workings of representation and expose the limits of rationality's reductive explanations. They push us to consider how the material world interacts with children, as we've heard many times that word today, this week, as with all of us, in ways that do not necessarily pass through language in its ordinary appearances, but may instead manifest as sense. So I think if we're to continue to consider explanation as part of our business as researchers, which I personally think we possibly should, then I think we should think of it as being, in James Williams' words, about connections and not about boxes. But all of this, as we've heard many times today, calls into question the very notion of what will count as data and our relation to those data. As several speakers have argued this week, data can't any longer be seen as an inert and indifferent mass, waiting to be informed and calibrated by our analytic acumen or our coding systems. Now, I'm quoting Hillary, quoting me, and we are in the world of the refrain, I guess, or of, me forging my own signature. But anyway. Okay, so we're no longer autonomous agents choosing and disposing. Rather, we're obliged to acknowledge that data have their ways of making themselves intelligible to us. And this can be seen or felt on occasions when you become especially interested in a piece of data. And I've called it, somewhat to my regret now on some occasions, the point where a piece of data starts to glow. And it might be a sarcastic comment in an interview, or a perplexing incident, or an observed event that makes you feel kind of peculiar. Or it might be some point in the pedestrian process of writing up a piece of research where something not yet quite articulated seems to take off and take over, effecting a kind of quantum leap to somewhere unpredictable. On those occasions, occasion feels distributed and undecidable, as if we've chosen something that's chosen, as if we have chosen something that's chosen us. And I've described that before in relation to the notion of wonder, which Hillary mentioned yesterday, and which is sometimes described as a thinking feeling. So it is that kind of crossing the boundaries. And when that happens, we become momentarily aware that we're not selecting and mastering the data, but rather that an event of data is running through us. And we've heard a bit about the Deleuzian event this week. I'm not even going to try to go there today, for reasons of personal incompetence. But still, we know what we might be able to do and not do with language, but there's still more work to be done, I think, on the status of language itself within a materialist research practice. Perhaps the shock of the altered status of language has not yet been fully felt. We surely can't expect language to work in the old ways in the material, discursive, mangle or manifold. Or at least not only in those ways. And Deleuze's logic of sense urges a radically different view, one which does not see language as belonging on one side of two already distinct realms, discourse and matter, that will connect in the mangle. Rather, as I mentioned at the start, language is the metaphysical surface, in Deleuze's terms, on which the very distinction between words and things is played out. So it's not just that language is demoted from its imperial position as mediator of the world, it's that language itself, in a materialist conceptualization, ought to be so fundamentally changed as to become almost unrecognizable or unrepresentable. Thinking specifically of the language of research, we now know that we might have to find a language that would be non-representational, non-interpretive, asignifying, asubjective, paradoxical, and embroiled with matter. So if you have any ideas about how to do that, put them on a postcard or a Dropbox, which we may actually do. And a reading of data as sense event offers one point of entry. And for Deleuze, sense and the event are in fact one and the same, or perhaps two and the same, and distinguished only to the extent that we might be focusing on the material non-side of the Mobius strip, which in case we're talking about the event, or on the other side, the linguistic or propositional side, bearing in mind that there is only one side. But we also need to think, to find ways of researching and thinking that can engage more fully with the materiality of language itself, the fact that it's in and of the body, always issuing from it, being impeded by the body, affecting other bodies. Yet, of course, always leaving the body, becoming immaterial, ideational, representational, and so on. And qualitative research, of course, is heavily invested in language practices, all those interviews, field notes, focus groups, conversations, seminars, people standing up and reading out scholarly papers, summer institutes and so on. But these forms of language frequently find the body entanglements of language troublesome or trivial, and they often focus instead, as I've said, on the ideational and the cultural aspects of utterances, spoken or written, what they mean, whether they're true, valid or consistent, whether they can be generalized to other contexts, whether they're collectible and codable, how well arguments hold together, how power and subjectivity are constructed and negotiated. These are all representational issues and not improper questions, but not what I want to focus on here. Method, qualitative method, is much less assured at dealing with the quasi-linguistic stuff, such as Hannah's silence and the vomit, and all the tears and the sneers and the silences and the sniffs and the laughter and the snot, and the twitches or the coughs that are part of utterances. Interviews, transcripts seldom record what eyebrows, hands, shoulders or crossed legs are doing, and if they do attend to such features, the aim is often either to point out what they mean or to use the non-linguistic as an aid